On Christmas Eve night, the twins went to the cemetery to visit their mother's grave. A billionaire, passing by, overheard their heartfelt wish and could not hold back his tears. The scent of pine and cinnamon lingered in the air, but for Sophie and Thomas that aroma only intensified the ache of loss. The 12-year-old twins huddled in their beds in the orphanage dormitory, Christmas lights blinking outside the foggy window, mocking the darkness in their hearts. Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, trying to hold back tears. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence of the night, "are you awake?" A gentle movement came from the bed beside her. "Yes," came her brother's soft reply. "I can't sleep." How could they? It was Christmas Eve, their first without their mother. The memory of her recent loss struck Sophie like an icy wave. 6 months earlier, the shrill sound of the hospital bell still echoed in their ears. The fluorescent lights flickered, making everything feel surreal. Sophie gripped Thomas's hand so tightly that her knuckles were white. "I'm sorry, children," the doctor's voice seemed to come from far away. "We did everything we could, but—" The rest dissolved into a blur of crying and muffled screams. Their mother, Claire, their only known family, was gone. A stupid car accident had stolen everything from them in a matter of seconds. Back in the present, Sophie swallowed hard, the lump in her throat threatening to choke her. She rose silently, her bare feet touching the cold floor. Thomas followed, as he always did. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, the twins looked almost ethereal. Identical blonde hair, deep blue eyes, mirrors of each other, bound by a pain no one else could fully understand. "Look what I found," Thomas whispered, pulling something from beneath his pillow. It was a crumpled photograph. The three of them, Sophie, Thomas, and their mother, radiant smiles frozen in time. It had been taken the previous Christmas, before their world fell apart. Sophie traced her mother's face in the photo with a trembling finger. "She looked so happy," she murmured. "She was," Thomas answered, his voice thick. "Remember how she always said we were her greatest gift?" A sob escaped Sophie before she could contain it. The orphanage walls seemed to close in on them, stifling in their impersonality. Cheerful posters and festive decorations could not mask the reality. This wasn't a home. It was just a place where children with no one else waited for something, anything. "We can't stay here," Sophie said suddenly, a fierce determination shining in her eyes. "Not tonight." Thomas stared at her, understanding dawning on his face. "The cemetery." Sophie nodded. "We have to see her. It's Christmas, Thomas. She shouldn't be alone." It was madness, of course. 2 12-year-olds wandering around the city on Christmas Eve night. But logic had no place in their hearts at that moment. Only the desperate need to feel close to the one person who had truly loved them. "How do we get out of here?" Thomas asked, already searching for their warmest clothes. Sophie pointed to the window. "There's a tree right there. If we can get it open, we can climb down." As they prepared silently, adrenaline surged through their veins. It was dangerous. It was insane. But for the first time in months, they felt alive, united in a purpose. Sophie took one last look at the dormitory as she helped Thomas open the window. The other children slept soundly, likely dreaming of presents and joy. But for the twins, the only gift that mattered lay miles away, beneath the cold earth of the local cemetery. "Ready?" Sophie whispered, holding Thomas's hand. He squeezed back, his eyes reflecting the same mixture of fear and determination. "Ready." And with that, they disappeared into the night, leaving behind the artificial warmth of the orphanage. The icy wind bit their faces as they carefully climbed down the tree, but they barely felt it. Their hearts beat with a single thought: "We're coming, Mum, hold on." Little did they know that their journey that night would change their lives forever, that in a snow-covered cemetery, under the starlight of Christmas, fate had arranged a meeting that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, loss, and new beginnings. The city slept, wrapped in festive lights and silence. But for Sophie and Thomas, the real adventure was only beginning. The biting night wind whipped Sophie and Thomas's faces as they slipped through the silent streets. Freshly fallen snow crunched under their feet, the only sound in a slumbering city on Christmas Eve. Festive lights blinked on surrounding homes, creating a surreal contrast to the twins' somber mission. "It's so cold," Sophie whispered, her teeth chattering. She pulled her thin coat tighter around herself, regretting not having snatched thicker jackets from the orphanage closet. Thomas nodded, rubbing his gloved hands together. "We have to keep moving. It'll keep us warm." They pressed on, two small figures against the city's vast white emptiness. Streets that were normally crowded were deserted, giving the impression they were the last living souls in a world frozen in time. At every corner, the twins paused, hearts pounding, afraid of being discovered. The fear of being caught and taken back to the orphanage was a constant presence, rivaling the cold biting their cheeks. "Look," Thomas suddenly pointed. At the end of the street, a church rose, its tower illuminated like a beacon in the night. "Remember how Mom took us to the Christmas Eve service every year?" Sophie swallowed hard, the memory delivering a sharp pang of pain. She always made hot chocolate afterward. For a moment, they stood there, lost in recollection. The distant sound of bells broke the spell, reminding them of their mission. "Come on," Sophie tugged at her brother. "We can't stop now." As they moved on, the city around them seemed to change. Festively decorated houses gave way to darker buildings, fewer lights. The cemetery was close, its presence already weighing on the air. A dog barked somewhere, making them both jump. Sophie grabbed Thomas's hand, her eyes wide with fear. "Shh," Thomas whispered, though his own heart was racing. "It's okay. No one saw us." They continued in silence, each step carrying them closer to their destination. Exhaustion began to weigh on their young limbs, but determination pushed them onward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the cemetery gates appeared ahead. Tall and rusty, they seemed to guard the boundary between the world of the living and the dead. To the twins' surprise, the gates were slightly ajar. A small sign reading, "Open for nighttime visits, Christmas Eve." "I didn't know they did that," Sophie murmured, a shiver running down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Thomas shrugged, his voice trembling. Maybe other people want to visit their loved ones tonight too." They exchanged a look, seeking courage in each other before stepping into the cemetery. The silence that surrounded them was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It wasn't the welcoming silence of a sleeping home, nor the tense silence of the orphanage at night. It was a living silence, laden with memories and a peace that seemed otherworldly. Headstones stretched out in all directions, some ornate, others simple, all blanketed by a white veil of snow. Here and there, small candles flickered, left by other nighttime visitors, creating an almost magical atmosphere. Sophie and Thomas moved slowly, their steps muffled by the snow. They knew the path by heart. The visits to their mother's grave had been frequent in the first few months after her death. "There," Thomas pointed, his voice little more than a whisper. Claire's headstone was simple but elegant. "Claire Dupont, beloved mother and daughter," still read the inscription. Below were the dates marking a life ended far too soon. For a moment, the twins were frozen, the reality of their loss hitting them with renewed force. Sophie was the first to move, falling to her knees in the snow before the grave. Thomas followed, silent tears streaming down his face. "Hi, Mom," Sophie began, her voice trembling. "Merry Christmas." Thomas sobbed beside her. "We miss you so much." Then the words began to flow, months of bottled-up emotions finally spilling out. They told Claire about the orphanage, how hard it was without her, about their fears and hopes. "Sometimes," Sophie confessed, "I wake up and for a second I forget that you're gone, and then it hurts all over again," Thomas completed, holding his sister's hand. The wind blew softly, rustling the nearby branches. For an instant, it felt like a gentle caress, as if Claire were responding to her children's call. "Mom," Sophie said suddenly, urgency in her voice, "I know you never told us much about our father, but we need him now. We need someone, Mom." Thomas nodded, wiping his tears. "Please, if you can hear us from somewhere, help us find him. We need a home again." The silence that followed was profound, weighted with emotion and expectation. The twins remained there, embraced, lost in thoughts and memories. They didn't notice the solitary figure watching them from a distance, a tall man whose rigid posture couldn't hide the emotion in his eyes. The wind blew again, stronger this time, carrying the distant sound of Christmas bells. Sophie and Thomas stood up, feeling strangely lighter despite their exhaustion. "Merry Christmas, Mom," they said in unison, their voices echoing softly among the headstones. As they turned to leave, they had no idea that their desperate wish had been heard. That the journey begun on that cold Christmas Eve would lead them to discoveries that would change their lives forever. The cemetery remained behind, silent and unchanging. But for Sophie and Thomas, something had shifted. A spark of hope, as fragile as a candle flame, had ignited in their hearts. Christmas Eve had only just begun, and destiny was about to intervene in ways they could never have imagined. Snow fell softly, creating an ethereal veil over the cemetery. Sophie and Thomas remained kneeling before their mother's grave, their small, vulnerable silhouettes against the vast sea of white headstones. The silence was almost tangible, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the nearby trees. "Mom," Sophie began, her voice trembling, "I don't know if you can hear us, but we need you so much right now." Thomas nodded, swallowing a sob. "The orphanage is awful, Mom. No one really cares about us there. It's like we're invisible." Sophie took her brother's hand, squeezing it for comfort. "Remember how you always said we were an unbeatable team, the three of us? Now it feels like Thomas and I are lost without you to guide us." A few yards away, partially hidden by an old oak tree, stood Paul Durand. The 60-year-old billionaire watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and restrained emotion. He had come to the cemetery for his annual visit to his late wife's grave, but the sight of the lonely twins intrigued him, holding him there. Back at the grave, Thomas wiped his tears on his sleeve. "Mom, I know you never liked talking about our father, but now more than ever we wish we knew who he is." Sophie looked at her brother, surprised by his boldness, but agreed. "It's true. Maybe if we could find him, we'd have a chance at a real family again, a real home." Paul shifted uneasily in his hiding spot. The twins' conversation stirred up long-buried memories of his own lost son. "Sometimes," Sophie continued, "I imagine what he might be like. Does he have blue eyes like ours, Thomas? Does he like pistachio ice cream like we do?" Thomas gave a sad chuckle. "Maybe he likes telling bedtime stories like Mom did. Or maybe," Sophie added, her voice dropping to a whisper, "he doesn't even know we exist." The weight of these words hung in the air, making Paul hold his breath. He fought the urge to step forward, to offer comfort to these children who so obviously needed it. "Mom," Thomas spoke again, determination entering his voice, "if you can hear us, please give us a sign. Help us find our father. We need a home again." Sophie hugged her brother, both trembling not only from the cold, but from emotion. "We just want to belong somewhere again, Mom, to have someone who truly cares about us." Paul felt his heart tighten. The twins' words echoed a pain he knew well, the pain of loneliness, of loss, of yearning for connection. "Remember the last time we were all together on Christmas?" Sophie asked, a sad smile appearing on her lips. "You made that huge turkey and almost set the kitchen on fire." Thomas laughed softly. "And then we had to order pizza. It was the best Christmas ever." "Now," Sophie continued, her voice cracking, "it feels like we'll never have a Christmas like that again. Happy and together." The wind blew stronger, causing the twins to huddle closer. Paul watched, feeling an increasing urge to intervene, to do something. "Mom," Thomas said, his voice barely audible, "if we can't have our father back, at least send us someone who can give us a home, a chance to be happy again." Sophie nodded, tears silently streaming down her face. "We haven't asked for much these past months, but please, this is our Christmas wish. A family, a home. Someone to love us like you did." The words lingered in the air, heavy with hope and despair. Paul felt something break inside him. Years of carefully built walls around his heart began to crumble. The twins fell silent, as if waiting for an answer from beyond. When nothing came, Sophie finally stood, pulling Thomas up with her. "We should go," she said softly. "It's getting late, and if they find out we ran away, Thomas nodded reluctantly. Yes, we have to get back before anyone notices. They turned to leave, casting one last glance at their mother's grave. "Merry Christmas, Mom," they said in unison, their voices filled with love and longing. As the twins walked away, Paul finally emerged from his hiding place. He watched the small figures disappear among the headstones, feeling a mix of emotions he hadn't experienced in years. Approaching the grave the twins had visited, Paul read the name Claire Dupont. Something about that name bothered him, like a distant memory trying to surface. "Claire," he murmured, "who were those children? And why do I feel like I should know them?" The wind blew again, softer this time, as if in answer. Paul looked up at the sky, seeing the stars shining through dispersing clouds. In that moment, he made a decision. He didn't know why exactly, but he felt compelled to help those twins. Maybe it was the Christmas spirit. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe it was just the need to fill the emptiness in his own heart. "I'll find them," Paul promised, not only to himself, but to Claire's spirit, to his own late wife, and to the son he had lost so long ago. "I'll give them the home they so desperately want." With that promise, Paul left the grave, his mind already forming plans. He didn't know it yet, but his decision on this Christmas Eve would set into motion a series of events that would change not only the twins' lives, but his own, in ways he could never have imagined. The cemetery was left behind, silent and unchanging. But in the air, there was a sense that something important had happened, as if the universe had heard the desperate wish of two lonely children and decided to intervene, using a solitary billionaire with his own wounds to heal as its instrument. Christmas Eve had barely begun, and with it, a journey of discovery, forgiveness, and perhaps redemption. The snow creaked under Sophie and Thomas's feet as they left the cemetery, their shoulders hunched against the biting wind. The weight of their visit to their mother's grave still hung over them, mingling with the fear of what they might face upon returning to the orphanage. "Sophie," Thomas whispered, his voice shaking with cold and apprehension. "What if they've already noticed we're gone?" Sophie squeezed her brother's hand, trying to convey a confidence she did not feel. "We'll think of something. We always do, right?" At that moment, the sound of footsteps behind them made the twins freeze. They turned slowly, fear etched on their young faces. Paul emerged from the darkness, his imposing figure softened by the gentle expression on his face. "Hello?" he said quietly, keeping a respectful distance. "It's a cold night for two children to be out alone, don't you think?" Sophie instinctively pulled Thomas behind her, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear. Paul gave a sad smile, recognizing the fear in their eyes. "My name is Paul. I was visiting someone in the cemetery, and I couldn't help but notice you two." Thomas peeked from behind Sophie. You heard us?" Paul nodded slowly. "I did, and I was very moved by what you said." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'd like to help if you'll let me." Sophie frowned, her protective stance unchanged. "Help how? Why? You don't even know us." "It's true. I don't know you," Paul agreed. "But I know what it's like to feel alone on Christmas. I know what it's like to lose someone you love." Something in Paul's voice, a genuine note of sadness, made Sophie relax slightly. Thomas, always more trusting, took a step forward. "You lost someone too?" he asked softly. Paul swallowed, painful memories rising. "Yes," he answered after a moment. "My wife, many years ago. And my son." "Not in the same way you lost your mother, but what happened to your son?" Sophie asked, curiosity momentarily eclipsing caution. Paul looked away, pain evident in his face. "We drifted apart. Mistakes were made, harsh words were spoken, and now I don't know where he is or how to find him." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken emotions. The twins exchanged looks, an unspoken conversation passing between them. "You mentioned an orphanage," Paul continued gently. "I assume you have nowhere else to go tonight?" Sophie hesitated, but Thomas answered, "There's the orphanage, but It's not a home, it's not like having a family. Paul nodded understandingly. I see. Well, I have a large house, much bigger than I need, in fact. If you'd like, I can offer you a warm place to spend the night. A good Christmas dinner. And maybe we can talk about how I can help you in the long term. The twins' eyes widened at the offer. It was tempting, more tempting than anything they had experienced since their mother's death. But years of caution couldn't be ignored easily. How do we know we can trust you? Sophie asked, her voice tinged with both hope and fear. Paul smiled gently. That's a very wise question, Sophie. You can't know for sure, not yet. But I can promise this. If at any moment you feel uncomfortable or want to leave, I will take you back to the orphanage immediately. No questions asked. He paused, then added softly, sometimes we have to have a little faith, especially at Christmas. Thomas looked at Sophie, his eyes pleading. Sophie, please, it's just one night. And maybe it's the sign we asked Mom for. Sophie bit her lip, conflict evident on her face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly. All right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We'll go with you. But if anything strange happens, you can leave immediately, Paul finished, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. You have my word. With that, Paul gently guided the twins toward his car, parked not far away. As they walked, he couldn't help noticing how Sophie kept a protective arm around Thomas, her eyes constantly vigilant. Upon reaching the car, a luxurious yet discreet model, Paul opened the back door. Please, get in. The heater is on. Thomas climbed in first, sighing with pleasure at the sudden warmth. Sophie hesitated for a moment before following, her eyes never leaving Paul. As Paul settled into the driver's seat, he felt a mixture of emotions, relief at having helped, apprehension about what the future held, and a strange sense of familiarity that unsettled him. Ready? He asked, looking at the twins in the rearview mirror. Sophie and Thomas nodded, their faces a mixture of fear and hope. As the car pulled away from the cemetery, Paul couldn't help thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, this Christmas could be the start of something new, not only for Sophie and Thomas, but for himself as well. None of them knew that this Christmas Eve would trigger a series of events changing their lives forever, revealing long-buried secrets and forging bonds that transcended blood and time. The Durand mansion's gate opened silently, revealing an imposing estate that left Sophie and Thomas breathless. Paul's car glided up the circular driveway, stopping at the base of a marble staircase leading to the main door. Welcome, Paul said softly, watching the twins' astonished expressions in the rearview mirror. Sophie and Thomas stepped out of the car, wide-eyed as they took in the mansion's facade. Soft lights illuminated the building's contours, giving it a magical air under the gently falling snow. It's huge, Thomas whispered, his voice a mix of awe and intimidation. Paul smiled kindly, guiding them toward the entrance. It might seem a bit much at first, but you'll get used to it. Inside, they were greeted by a spacious foyer tastefully decorated for Christmas. A towering tree occupied one corner, its ornaments sparkling in the soft glow. Martha, Paul called, and a middle-aged woman appeared almost instantly. Please prepare the guest rooms for Sophie and Thomas, and maybe something light to eat. Martha nodded, giving the twins a curious yet kind look before leaving. Come, Paul said, let's warm up in the living room while Martha gets everything ready. Sophie and Thomas followed him, their steps hesitant on the polished wood floor. The living room was cozy despite its size, with plush sofas and a lit fireplace. Please, sit down, Paul gestured toward the sofa. You must be exhausted. The twins sat, still glancing around with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Sophie, ever protective, kept Thomas close. I know all this must seem very strange, Paul began, sitting in an armchair opposite them, but I want you to know you're safe here. This can be your home for as long as you need it. Thomas offered a timid smile, but Sophie remained wary. Why are you doing this for us, Mr. Paul? What do you get out of this? Paul fell silent for a moment, considering his response. Maybe I'm seeking redemption. Or maybe I'm just an old lonely man trying to do something good at Christmas. He gave a sad smile. The truth is, you reminded me of what's truly important in life. Family, connection. Before the conversation could continue, Martha returned with a tray of sandwiches and hot chocolate. The aroma made the twins' stomachs growl audibly, reminding them how long it had been since their last meal. "Eat," Paul encouraged. "Afterward, we'll show you your rooms." While the children ate, Paul watched them, a strange sense of familiarity nagging at him. There was something about Sophie's eyes, about the way Thomas smiled. Later, after showing the twins their luxurious guest rooms, both enchanted and unsettled by the novelty, Paul retired to his office. The night had been long and emotional, but he couldn't sleep. Something compelled him to investigate further. Sitting at his mahogany desk, Paul turned on his computer. "Claire Dupont," he murmured, typing the name into a search engine. Limited information appeared, an obituary, a few mentions in local newspapers, nothing explaining why he felt he should know that name. Frustrated, Paul got up and approached a nearby bookshelf. His fingers ran along the spines until they stopped at an old photo album. He pulled it out, feeling the weight of the memories it contained. Sitting down again, Paul opened the album, photos of his youth, his wedding, the birth of his son, and then he stopped at one particular image. It was a summer picnic decades ago. A younger Paul smiling with his arm around his wife, but it was the young woman beside them that caught his attention. "No, it can't be," he whispered, leaning closer. The young woman had a radiant smile, bright blue eyes that seemed oddly familiar. Paul turned the photo over, reading the inscription on the back. "Summer 95, Paul, Marie, and Claire." Claire, the same name as Sophie and Thomas's mother. Paul's heart raced. Could it be a coincidence? Or was there a deeper connection he didn't yet understand? Flipping more pages, Paul found other photos of Claire at parties, family dinners. She seemed to have been a constant presence in their lives for a few years, before disappearing abruptly from the images. Paul leaned back in his chair, his mind whirling with possibilities. Why didn't he remember Claire clearly? What had happened for her to leave their lives? And more importantly, what was the connection between her and the twins now sleeping under his roof? A sudden thought hit him, making him gasp. The twins' age, the time that had passed since he last saw Claire. Could it be possible? Paul shook his head, trying to organize his thoughts. It was late, and he was tired. He needed more information before jumping to conclusions. Carefully replacing the album, Paul made a mental note to hire a discreet private investigator in the morning. There were mysteries to unravel, and he was determined to find the truth. As he prepared for bed, Paul couldn't help but think about the twins, Sophie, with her protective nature and suspicious eyes, Thomas with his easy smile and palpable curiosity. Somehow, in just one night, they had become important to him. "What are you up to, Fate?" Paul murmured to the empty room. Across the hall, Sophie and Thomas slept soundly for the first time in months, their minds finally at peace, if only temporarily. None of them knew that the events of this Christmas Eve had set a series of revelations in motion that would forever alter their lives. As the night wore on, the Durand mansion rested in silence, its new occupants unaware of the secrets and connections soon to surface, redrawing the contours of their stories and redefining the meaning of family. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold over the Durand mansion. Paul, who had barely slept, was already in his office, pressing the phone to his ear. "Yes, I need a full investigation on Claire Dupont," he spoke quietly. "Absolute discretion is essential, and if possible, I want information on her child." Hanging up, Paul sighed heavily. The discovery of Claire's photo the night before had unleashed a flood of memories and questions. He leaned back in his chair, letting his mind wander to the past. 25 years earlier. "Dad, you can't control my life." Robert's voice echoed through the mansion, furious and defiant. "I love Claire and I'm going to marry her, whether you like it or not." Paul, younger but already with grey at his temples, clenched his fists. "You barely know her, Robert. What will you do with your life? Abandon college, throw away your future for a summer fling?" "Claire is not just a summer fling," Robert retorted, eyes flashing with anger. "She understands me in a way you never have." The words hit Paul like a punch. I only want what's best for you, son. No, Robert said, his voice cold. You want what's best for you, for your legacy. Well, guess what? I'm not you, Dad, and I never will be. With that, Robert stormed out, slamming the door so hard the pictures on the wall shook. Weiskeep sat and back in the present. Paul rubbed his tired eyes. That argument had been the beginning of the end. Robert left that night, taking Claire with him. Attempts at reconciliation failed, thwarted by both sides' stubbornness, until eventually silence became permanent. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Sophie and Thomas entered timidly, still wearing borrowed pajamas that seemed too large on their thin frames. "Good morning," Paul smiled, quickly hiding the papers on his desk. "Merry Christmas. Did you sleep well?" Thomas nodded enthusiastically. The bed was so soft, like sleeping on a cloud. Sophie, always more reserved, merely murmured a quiet, "Yes, thank you." It was then that Paul noticed. In the morning light, the similarities were undeniable. Sophie's deep blue eyes were identical to Robert's, and Thomas's easy smile, it was Claire's smile. "Mr. Paul," Thomas's voice brought him back to the present. "Are you okay?" "You look strange." Paul forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a bit tired. How about we go down for breakfast? I bet Martha prepared something special for Christmas." Leading the children to the dining room, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking at ghosts from his past. Breakfast passed in a mix of childish enthusiasm, mainly from Thomas, and cautious conversation. Sophie, though still wary, began to relax slightly. "Mr. Paul," she said suddenly, her eyes fixed on a portrait on the wall. "Who's that in the photo?" Paul followed her gaze, his heart clenching. It was a photo of Robert on his 20th birthday, just before the big fight. That's my son, Robert," Paul replied, his voice rough. Thomas approached the photo, eyes wide. "He looks a bit like us, doesn't he, Sophie?" Sophie nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, he has. He has the same eyes we do." Paul felt the air grow heavy around him. The puzzle pieces were fitting together in a way he both feared and longed for. "Children," he said softly, "what do you know about your father?" Sophie tensed visibly. "Almost nothing. Mom, she never liked to talk about him." Thomas agreed. "She only said he had to go away before we were born." "That sometimes adults make mistakes." Paul nodded slowly, his heart heavy. "I see. Well, how about we open presents? It's Christmas after all." Momentarily distracted by the mention of gifts, the children ran to the living room, where a pile of packages waited beneath the tree. Alone for a moment, Paul let out a shaky sigh. He needed answers, and fast. Martinden later that night, after a day filled with holiday festivities that left Sophie and Thomas exhausted and asleep, Paul received a call. "Mr. Durand, we have the information you requested about Claire Dupont." Paul straightened in his chair. "Go on." "Claire died 6 months ago in a car accident. She left behind twin children, Sophie and Thomas, now 12. The children's father is not listed on the birth certificate, but, Paul pressed, heart pounding, "we found medical records from a prenatal visit. The father listed is Robert Durand." Paul closed his eyes, a mix of emotions flooding him. Confirmation, relief, guilt, anger. "There's more, Mr. Durand. We tried to locate Robert, but there are no records of him for the past 12 years. It's as if he disappeared." Paul thanked the investigator mechanically and hung up. His son had vanished. His grandchildren were orphans, and by a twist of fate they were all under the same roof. Standing slowly, Paul walked to the window, watching the snow fall softly outside. The world seemed so peaceful, so oblivious to the turmoil in his heart. He thought of Sophie and Thomas, sleeping soundly in their new rooms. He thought of Robert, somewhere unknown, perhaps not even aware he was a father. He thought of Claire, whose life was cut short so cruelly. "What do I do now?" Paul murmured to the fogged glass. He knew the answer wouldn't be simple. Should he tell the children? Search for Robert? Keep the secret? One thing, however, was clear. Sophie and Thomas were family. His grandchildren, and he would do everything in his power to protect them and give them the home they so desperately desired. With this resolve, Paul turned away from the window. The road ahead would be hard, filled with painful revelations and difficult decisions. But for the first time in years, Paul felt a renewed sense of purpose. Christmas had brought more than material gifts. It had brought a second chance, an opportunity to correct past mistakes and, perhaps, rebuild the family he thought he had lost forever. As the night wore on, the Durand mansion rested in a silence filled with promises and secrets on the verge of being revealed. Destiny had woven a complex web, uniting past and present, and now it was up to Paul to navigate this maze of emotions and long-buried truths. The sun had barely risen when Paul found himself back in his office, eyes fixed on a photo of Robert he hadn't dared to look at in years. The revelation of the previous night weighed on him like an anchor, pulling him into a sea of doubts and regrets. "My grandchildren," he murmured, the words sounding strange on his lips. Sophie and Thomas, the children fate had placed in his path, carried his blood. The irony wasn't lost on him. After years of self-imposed solitude, life presented him with a second chance in the form of two orphaned children. A soft knock on the door. "Come in," he said, quickly putting the photo away. Martha, the housekeeper, entered with a tray of coffee. "Sir, the children are awake. Shall I serve breakfast?" Paul nodded, running a hand over his tired face. "Yes, please. I'll be there in a moment." Alone again, Paul allowed himself a moment of vulnerability. How would he tell Sophie and Thomas? Should they even know the truth could bring comfort, a sense of belonging they yearned for? But it could also open old wounds. With a deep sigh, he stood and headed to the dining room. The children's voices greeted him, a sharp contrast to the storm inside him. "Good morning, Mr. Paul," Thomas exclaimed, his smile so similar to Claire's it hurt. Sophie, always more reserved, offered a timid nod. "Good morning," she murmured, her blue eyes, Robert's eyes, studying Paul intently. "Good morning, children," Paul replied, forcing a smile. "I hope you slept well." As they sat down for breakfast, Paul couldn't help noticing all the small similarities that now seemed glaring. The way Thomas tilted his head when he laughed, exactly as Robert once did. The determination in Sophie's gaze, so like Claire's. "Mr. Paul," Sophie began cautiously, "may we ask something?" Paul felt his heart speed up. "Of course, dear." "What is it?" "You mentioned your son yesterday," she continued, exchanging a quick glance with Thomas. "Where is he now? Why doesn't he live here?" The question hit Paul like a blow to the stomach. He set down his fork slowly, searching for the right words. "Robert, my son, we had a falling out many years ago," he began, choosing each word carefully. "He decided to follow his own path, and we lost touch." Thomas frowned. "You fought? Like we sometimes fought with Mom?" Paul felt a lump in his throat. "Something like that, Thomas. But much worse. I said things I shouldn't have, made choices I regret deeply." Sophie, always perceptive, leaned forward. "And you never tried to find him, to apologize?" The innocence of her question struck Paul's guilt. I tried at first, but Robert didn't want to be found. And over time, sometimes pride keeps us from doing the right thing." A heavy silence fell over the table. Paul could feel the weight of the children's gaze, full of unasked questions and innocent judgments. "You know," Thomas said suddenly, his voice soft, "our mom always said family is the most important thing. That no matter what happens, we should try to forgive and be there for each other." Thomas's words hit Paul like a revelation. Claire, even after everything, had taught her children the value of family. The irony was almost painful. Sophie nodded, her eyes fixed on Paul. "Mr. Paul, you do look a bit like your son in that photo. And sometimes, when I look at Thomas, I think he looks a bit like you too." Paul's heart nearly stopped. Sophie's insight was alarming. He knew he was at a crossroads. Reveal the truth now, or keep the secret. "Children," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something But before he could continue, Martha entered hurriedly. "Mr. Durand, there's an urgent call for you in the office." Paul hesitated, torn between the need to speak and the sudden interruption. I need to take this, but we'll return to this conversation. I promise." He rose quickly. almost knocking over his chair in his haste. In the hallway, away from the children's curious eyes, Paul leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. The tension of the moment, the near revelation, had shaken him. He knew he couldn't delay the truth much longer. Sophie and Thomas deserved to know, but how to tell two children who just lost their mother that their missing father was his son, that he, a stranger until days ago, was actually their grandfather? In the office, the call was from the investigator, with more details about Claire's past and some leads on Robert's possible whereabouts, but Paul could barely focus. His mind was filled with scenarios, imagining how the children would react to the truth. After hanging up, Paul sat motionless for long minutes. The weight of the decision crushed him. Telling the truth could bring comfort, the sense of belonging Sophie and Thomas so desperately wanted, but it could also open wounds for which he had no answers. What if the children blamed him for Robert's abandonment? What if they wanted to find their father, only to be rejected again? Paul stood and walked to the window. Outside, he saw Sophie and Thomas playing in the snow, their laughter echoing in the garden. For a moment, he glimpsed a future. Joyful Christmases, birthdays celebrated, a family reunited. But to reach that future, he knew he had to face the past. Tell the truth, with all its complexities and pain. With a deep sigh, Paul made his decision. He would tell Sophie and Thomas everything. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. They deserved the truth, and he was determined to be the grandfather they deserved, even if it meant reliving his own failures. As he watched the children play, Paul made a silent promise. This time he would do things right. For Sophie, for Thomas, for Claire's memory, and maybe, just maybe, for a chance to reconcile with Robert too. The path ahead would be difficult, full of painful conversations and shocking revelations, but for the first time in years, Paul felt hope. The family he thought he had lost forever was within reach. Now he needed the courage to embrace it, with all its imperfections and challenges. The afternoon light dimmed in Paul's office when he finally took action. With a heavy sigh, he picked up the phone and dialed the private investigator's number. "Mr. Jenkins, it's Paul Durand. I need you to intensify the search for my son, Robert, no matter the cost or how long it takes. Find him." Hanging up the phone, Paul felt a mix of determination and apprehension. Finding Robert wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary, not just for him, but for Sophie and Thomas. Meanwhile, upstairs, the children's curiosity reached its peak. Taking advantage of Paul's distraction, Sophie and Thomas decided to explore the mansion. "Thomas, don't you think it's strange how Mr. Paul sometimes looks at us?" Sophie whispered, as they climbed the stairs to the attic. Thomas nodded, eyes shining with excitement. "Yes, and did you see how nervous he got when we asked about his son?" Reaching the attic, they found a sea of dusty boxes and old furniture. Sophie, always methodical, suggested, "Let's look for photos or anything that might tell us more about Mr. Paul's family." After a few minutes of searching, Thomas let out a muffled exclamation. "Sophie, look at this." In his hands was an old photo album with a worn leather cover. The children sat on the dusty floor, opening the album with reverent care. The first pages showed a younger Paul, smiling beside a beautiful woman. "Must be his wife," Sophie murmured. As they turned the pages, they saw a baby, then a boy, and finally, a young man who looked remarkably like Thomas. "That's his son, Robert," Thomas exclaimed, wide-eyed. "Sophie, he looks like me." Sophie studied the photo carefully, her heart racing. The similarities were undeniable, the smile, the eyes, even the posture. Then one picture in particular caught her attention. "Thomas, look at this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The photo showed Robert, about 20 years old, with his arm around a young woman. A woman who looked strangely familiar. "Isn't that—" Thomas stammered, unable to finish the sentence. "Our mother," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. The shock of the discovery left the children silent for several minutes. Their young minds struggled to process the implications of what they were seeing. "Sophie," Thomas finally spoke, his voice trembling, "do you think Mr. Paul might be our grandfather?" Sophie completed, the realization landing on her like a weight. "And Robert, he might be our father." The sound of footsteps in the hall snapped them out of their stupor. Quickly, they closed the album and hid it back in the box. "Children," Paul's voice echoed through the house. "Where are you?" Sophie and Thomas exchanged looks, a silent decision passing between them. It was time to confront Paul. Descending the stairs, they found Paul in the foyer, worry etched on his face. "Oh, there you are," he said, relieved. "I was worried." "Where? Mr. Paul?" Sophie interrupted, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "We need to talk." The seriousness in Sophie's tone made Paul pause. He looked from one twin to the other, noting their tense expressions and determined eyes. "Of course," he said slowly. "Let's go to the living room." Once seated, a heavy silence fell. Paul could sense a shift in the air, knowing instinctively that something had changed. "Mr. Paul," Thomas began, surprisingly steady, "we found something in the attic." Paul felt his heart accelerate. "What did you find?" Sophie leaned forward, her eyes, Robert's eyes, fixed on Paul. "A photo album, with pictures of you, your wife, and your son, Robert." Paul closed his eyes for a moment, bracing himself. When he opened them again, he saw determination on the children's faces. "There was a photo," Sophie continued, "of Robert with a woman who looked a lot like our mother." The silence that followed was deafening. Paul could hear his own heartbeat, the truth he'd tried to avoid now inevitable. "Mr. Paul," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly, Are you our grandfather?" The question hung in the air, laden with hope, fear, and a desperate need for truth. Paul felt tears forming in his eyes. With a shaky sigh, he finally answered, "Yes. Yes, I am." The impact of the confirmation was visible. Sophie recoiled slightly, as if physically struck, while Thomas let out a muffled sob. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sophie asked, her voice a mixture of anger and hurt. "Why hide it from us?" Paul leaned forward, fighting the urge to hug them both. I only found out recently, and I was trying to find the best way to tell you. I feared it would be too much after everything you've been through." "And Robert?" Thomas asked, tears shining in his eyes. He is our father." Paul nodded slowly. "Yes, he is. But Thomas, Sophie, there's a lot you need to understand. Robert and we fell out long before you were born. I didn't know about you or Claire's until very recently." Sophie, always the protector, stood abruptly. "Then why did he abandon us? Why didn't he ever look for us?" The pain in her voice was palpable, echoing years of unanswered questions. Paul felt his heart break. "I don't know, dear, but I'm doing everything I can to find him, to get answers for you, for all of us." A tense silence followed, each lost in their own thoughts and emotions. It was Thomas who finally broke it. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small and vulnerable. Paul rose slowly, approaching the children. "Now, if you'll let me, I want to be the grandfather you deserve, to give you the home and family you've been wishing for, and together we can try to find Robert and understand what happened." Sophie and Thomas exchanged looks, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Sophie turned to Paul. We need time to process all this," she said, her voice softer now. "But maybe we can try. Try being a family, I mean." Paul felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. "That's all I ask," he said gently, "a chance to make this work." As night fell on the Durand mansion, a new reality began to form. Long-buried truths had been revealed, opening the path to healing, forgiveness, cure, and perhaps the chance for a family to reconnect. Paul knew the road ahead would be hard. There was much to explain, much to repair, but as he looked at Sophie and Thomas, he saw a chance for redemption, an opportunity to right past wrongs and build a future together. The search for Robert would continue, but now with a renewed purpose. It wasn't just about finding a lost son, but about completing a long incomplete family puzzle. As Paul watched the children, his grandchildren, he made a silent promise. This time, he would do things right. For Sophie, for Thomas, for Claire's memory, and with the hope of one day reconciling with Robert. The journey was only beginning. But for the first time in years, the future seemed to shine with possibilities of love, forgiveness, and a chance for a reunited family. Morning sunlight filtered through the living room curtains, where Paul, Sophie, and Thomas were seated, the air heavy with the tension of the conversation about to occur. Paul looked into his grandchildren's anxious faces, searching for the right words to begin. "Sophie, Thomas," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "there's something important I need to tell you. Something about your father." The children exchanged quick, nervous glances, hope and apprehension mingling in their eyes. "Our father?" Thomas asked, leaning forward. "Do you know him?" Paul nodded slowly. "Yes, I do. As you've discovered, he's my son, Robert." Sophie, ever cautious, frowned. "But you said you hadn't spoken to him in years. How can you be sure he's our father?" "Good question, Sophie," Paul replied, admiring her perceptiveness. "I hired an investigator to learn more about you and your mother, Claire. The evidence strongly suggests that Robert is indeed your father." Thomas, eyes wide, asked, "Where is he now? Why didn't he ever look for us?" Paul felt a lump form in his throat. This was the hardest part. "I don't know exactly where Robert is now. We lost touch long before you were born." Sophie crossed her arms, a shadow passing over her face. "So he doesn't know about us? He abandoned Mom?" "I'm not sure if he knows about you," Paul admitted. "And as for what happened between him and Claire, there are many questions still unanswered." A heavy silence settled over the room. Paul could see the conflicting emotions on the children's faces. Hope, fear, anger, confusion. "What does this mean for us now?" Thomas finally asked, voice small and uncertain. Paul leaned forward, looking them in the eyes. "It means that, if you want, we can try to find Robert, discover the truth about what happened, and maybe give you the chance to know your father." Sophie, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "What if he doesn't want to know us? What if he knew about us all along and simply didn't care?" The pain in her voice was tangible, echoing years of abandonment and unanswered questions. Paul felt his heart tighten. "Sophie, Thomas, I can't promise it will be easy, or that we'll get all the answers we want, but I promise that, no matter what happens, you have me now. I'm your grandfather, and I will do everything I can to protect and love you." Thomas, tears in his eyes, asked, "Can we really try to find him?" Paul nodded. "Yes, we can. I've already started looking, but you must understand it might take time, and we don't know what we'll find." Sophie, ever practical, asked, "And if we find him, then what?" Paul thought carefully before answering. "Well, first I'd talk to him, explain the situation, and then, if everyone agrees, we could arrange a meeting, but only if you both feel ready." The children exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Sophie spoke for them both. "We want to try. We want to find him." Paul felt both relief and apprehension. "All right, then we'll do this together as a family." In the days that followed, the Durand mansion was filled with nervous anticipation. Paul intensified his efforts to locate Robert, spending hours on the phone and meeting with the private investigator. Sophie and Thomas oscillated between excitement and anxiety. They spent hours imagining what their father might be like, picturing different scenarios for their first meeting. One afternoon, while Paul was in his office, the phone rang. It was the investigator. "Mr. Durand, we have a promising lead. A man matching Robert's description was seen in a small town a few hours away." Paul's heart raced. "Are you sure?" "Not 100%, but the similarities are notable. We've sent someone to verify in person." Paul thanked him and hung up, his mind spinning. He stepped out of the office, finding Sophie and Thomas in the living room. "Children," he said, trying to contain his own excitement, "we have a lead on Robert's whereabouts. It's not certain yet, but it's promising." Thomas's eyes lit up. "Can we go see him?" Paul shook his head gently. "Not yet, Thomas. First, we need to confirm it's really him. And then I need to speak to him first." Sophie, always perceptive, noticed Paul's hesitation. "You're afraid, aren't you, of talking to him after all this time?" Paul smiled sadly. "Yes, Sophie, I am. There are many unsaid things between us, many mistakes I made, but I'm willing to face it all for you." The children approached, initiating their first group hug. Paul felt tears in his eyes as he wrapped his arms around his grandchildren. That night, after the children went to bed, Paul sat in his office, staring at the phone. With trembling hands, he dialed the number the investigator had provided. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Paul felt his heart in his throat. On the 4th ring, someone picked up. "Hello?" A male voice, strangely familiar, sounded on the other end. Paul froze for a moment, decades of repressed emotions threatening to overflow. "Hello?" the voice repeated, now with a hint of irritation. Paul closed his eyes, summoning courage. "Robert," he finally spoke, voice barely a whisper. "Son, it's me, your father." The silence that followed was deafening. Paul could hear his own breathing, fast and shallow. Then, a click. The line went dead. Paul set the phone down slowly, disappointment and determination washing over him. It wouldn't be easy, he knew. But for Sophie and Thomas, for Robert and for himself, he wouldn't give up. Gazing out the window at the starry night, Paul made a silent promise. He would reunite his family, no matter how long it took or how hard it was. He had taken the first step. Now it was a matter of persistence, patience, and above all, love. With that thought, Paul prepared for another restless night, knowing the coming days would bring challenges testing the fragile bonds of his newfound family. But for the first time in years, he faced the future not with fear, but with hope. Late afternoon light bathed Paul's office when the phone rang again. With his heart pounding, he answered. "Mr. Durand," the investigator's voice sounded urgent. "We've located your son. He's in a nearby town, working as a teacher at a local school." Paul felt the air rush out of his lungs. After weeks of searching, a concrete lead at last. "Are you absolutely sure?" "Yes, sir. We have photos and positive identification. It's definitely Robert Durand." With trembling hands, Paul wrote down the address and thanked the investigator. Hanging up, he leaned back in his chair, emotions swirling inside him. Flashback. 20 years earlier, the Durand mansion echoed with angry voices. "You can't control my life forever, Dad," Robert shouted, face flushed with rage. Paul, younger but no less stubborn, fired back. "I'm trying to protect you, son. That girl, Claire, she's only after your money, our name." "You know nothing about her," Robert retorted. "Claire loves me for who I am, not what I have. Something you never understood." The words cut Paul like knives. "If you walk out that door with her, Robert, don't bother coming back." Robert paused, hand on the doorknob. Father and son stared at each other, years of resentment and misunderstanding crystallizing in that moment. "Goodbye, Dad," Robert said at last, voice cold. With that, he left, leaving Paul alone with wounded pride and a broken heart he refused to acknowledge. Back in the present, Paul wiped away a solitary tear. So many years lost, so many words left unsaid. Now there was a chance to fix things. Gathering his courage, he left the office and found Sophie and Thomas in the library, Sophie reading while Thomas drew. "Children," Paul called softly. "I have news." The twins looked up, immediately alert. "Is it about our father?" Thomas asked, his voice barely containing his excitement. Paul nodded, sitting beside them. "Yes, we found him." Sophie let her book fall, eyes wide. "Really? Where is he? Does he know about us?" "He's in a town not too far from here," Paul explained. "And no, he doesn't know about you yet." "I thought we should decide together how to proceed." Thomas, tears in his eyes, asked, "Can we see him? Does he want to see us?" Paul hesitated. "I haven't spoken with him yet, Thomas. I thought I should talk to him first, explain the situation. If he's willing, then we could arrange a meeting." Sophie, ever cautious, asked, "What if he doesn't want to meet us?" The question hung heavy in the air, laden with the possibility of rejection and renewed pain. Paul took their hands, one in each of his. "Then we'll handle that together. No matter what happens, you have me now. We're a family." The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Paul made arrangements to travel to the town where Robert lived, while Sophie and Thomas swung between excitement and terror. On the eve of Paul's departure, the 3 of them gathered in the living room. "What if he's different than we imagined?" Thomas asked. his voice small. Sophie hugged her brother. "It doesn't matter. We have each other and we have Grandpa Paul now." Paul's heart warmed at hearing Sophie call him Grandpa for the first time. "Children," he said softly, "I want you to know that no matter what happens tomorrow, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Finding you gave me a second chance I didn't know I needed." Tears shone in all their eyes as they embraced, an unlikely family united by love and hope. The next morning, Paul set out early. The drive felt both too long and too short, every mile bringing him closer to a 2 decades-old confrontation. Arriving in the small town, Paul parked in front of the school where Robert worked. His heart pounded so fiercely, he feared it could be heard outside the car. Flashback. "Dad, look! I got top marks on my science project." A 12-year-old Robert ran through the house, waving a paper. Paul, busy with work documents, barely looked up. "Good job, son. Now why don't you go play outside? Daddy's busy." Robert's smile faltered, disappointment clear in his young eyes. He left quietly, while Paul remained immersed in his work, unaware of the crucial moment he had just wasted. Back in the present, Paul closed his eyes, guilt consuming him. So many missed moments, so many lost opportunities to be the father Robert deserved. With a deep breath, he got out of the car. The school bell rang and soon students began streaming out. Paul waited, his gaze scanning the crowd, and then he saw him. Robert, now middle-aged, emerged from the main building. Grey streaked his temples, but his smile addressed to a student he was chatting with was the same Paul remembered. For a moment, Paul was paralyzed. Every prepared speech vanished from his mind. Robert, sensing someone's gaze, looked in Paul's direction. His eyes widened in recognition, and for an instant, father and son stared at each other across the schoolyard, decades of untold history between them. Paul took a hesitant step forward. "Robert," he called, voice trembling. Robert stood still, surprise giving way to a complex mix of emotions on his face. In that moment, Paul knew nothing would ever be the same. For better or worse, this encounter would change everything. And somewhere, waiting anxiously at home, Sophie and Thomas awaited the outcome, their lives about to be forever altered. Taking another step forward, Paul prepared himself for the confrontation that would define the future of his newly rediscovered family. The past, present, and future converged at that moment, and everything depended on the next words exchanged between father and son. Silence reigned in Paul's office. Robert sat stiffly in an armchair, eyes darting between his father and the 2 children, who watched him with a mix of hope and fear. Sophie and Thomas, hurriedly brought over after the initial meeting, could barely contain their agitation. Paul cleared his throat, breaking the tense hush. "Robert," he began, voice trembling, "there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything." Robert frowned, arms crossed defensively. "What could be so important that you'd bring me back here after all these years, Dad?" Paul took a shaky breath, glancing at Sophie and Thomas before turning back to Robert. "Son, I'd like you to meet Sophie and Thomas. They are your children." The impact of this revelation was immediate. Robert went pale, eyes wide as he looked at the twins' faces. This can't be," he stammered. Sophie stepped forward, her voice surprisingly firm. "Our mother was Claire Dupont. You knew her, right?" The name hit Robert like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, staggering backward. "Claire? But how?" Paul approached Robert, his voice gentle but steady. "Son, Claire died a few months ago. These children were left orphaned. By some miracle of fate, they crossed my path and, well, here we are." Thomas, unable to contain himself, asked through tears, You knew about us?" The question hung in the air, carrying years of abandonment and longing. Robert closed his eyes, visibly fighting a storm of emotions. He began, voice barely audible. "I knew Claire was pregnant, but I ran away." The confession was a bombshell. Sophie recoiled as if struck, while Thomas let out a muffled sob. Paul felt anger surge within him. "You ran away! How could you, Robert? How could you abandon your own children?" Robert turned to face his father, tears streaming down his cheeks. "And you have the moral high ground here? You who cast me out because you didn't approve of my choices." "I made mistakes, yes," Paul admitted, voice firm. "But I never would have abandoned you." Robert spun toward the twins, shame weighing him down. "I was scared, okay? We were just 20. I wasn't ready to be a father. After our fight, after being disinherited, I panicked." Sophie, tears in her eyes, demanded, "So you just left us? Didn't even try to know us?" Robert faced her, regret etched in every line of his face. "I convinced myself you'd be better off without me. That Claire would find someone better, someone capable of being a good dad." Paul, unable to contain himself, asked, "And you never thought to check, to see how they were doing?" "I thought about it every day," Robert exploded, years of suppressed guilt pouring out. But the more time passed, the harder it became. How could I show up after years and say, "Oh, hey, I'm your dad"? What right did I have? Thomas, who had been quiet, took a step forward. "We needed you," he said simply, tears rolling down his face. "Mom always said you'd come back one day." Thomas's words seemed to break something inside Robert. He fell to his knees, sobs racking his body. "I'm so sorry," he cried. "I'm so sorry." Silence followed, deafening in its weight. Paul looked at his grandchildren, seeing the pain and confusion in their eyes. He knew he had to be strong for them now. "Robert," Paul said firmly, "what you did was unforgivable, but now you have a chance to do the right thing. These children, your children, need you." Sophie, always the bravest, approached Robert. "Why didn't you ever come back, even after all these years?" Robert raised his gaze to meet his daughters for the first time. I convinced myself you'd hate me, that it was too late." "It's never too late to do the right thing," Paul interjected, remembering his own failures as a father. "Believe me, I know that better than anyone." Thomas, emboldened, joined his sister. "We always wanted to meet you, to know why you weren't there." Robert reached out a trembling hand, almost touching his children, then pulling back at the last second. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve to be part of your lives after what I did." Paul placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "That's not for you to decide, son. It's for Sophie and Thomas. And for me." The children exchanged looks, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Sophie spoke. "We can't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe never. But—" She hesitated, glancing at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "But maybe we can try. Try getting to know you, understanding why you did what you did." Thomas added softly, "Mom always said everyone deserves a second chance. Maybe this is yours." Robert let out a sob of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "I promise I'll do everything in my power to earn this chance." Paul watched, heart heavy with conflicting emotions. There was so much healing to be done, so many bridges to rebuild. But in that moment, seeing his grandchildren tentatively reach out to Robert, he felt a spark of hope. "This won't be easy," Paul said, addressing everyone in the room. "There will be pain, anger, and many hard conversations ahead. But if we're all willing to try, maybe we can build something new, something better." Sophie and Thomas nodded slowly, still holding Robert's trembling hands. In that office, laden with emotions, a fractured family took its first tentative steps toward healing and reconciliation. The quiet that followed the revelation was brief and tense, like the calm before a storm. Sophie was the first to break it, her voice trembling with pent-up emotion. "You abandoned us," she said, the words hitting like a sharp accusation. "You knew about us and chose to leave." Thomas, usually the calmer twin, let out a pained sob. "Why?" he asked, voice shaking. "Why didn't you want us?" Robert, still on his knees, seemed smaller under the weight of guilt. I was scared," he tried to explain, voice barely a whisper. "I wasn't ready to be a father." "And you think Mom was ready to be a mother alone?" Sophie retorted, anger flaring. "She had to do everything herself, work 2 jobs, care for us." "Where were you?" Paul, sensing the need to intervene, took a step forward. "Children, I know you're hurt and angry, and you have every right to be, but maybe we should all take a deep breath and—" "No," Thomas interrupted. surprising everyone with his vehemence. "Don't try to soften this, Grandpa. He needs to know. Needs to know what it was like growing up thinking our father didn't love us enough to stay." Robert raised his eyes, tears still falling. "I'm sorry," he said, voice broken. "I know it's not enough, but I truly am. I was young, immature, and selfish. I thought you'd be better off without me." "Better without you?" Sophie repeated, incredulous. "Do you know how many nights we cried, wishing we had a father? How many times we saw other kids with their dads and wondered why we weren't loved enough to have ours?" Paul felt his heart break at the pain in their voices. Turning to Robert, his own anger rose. "How could you do this, son? Abandon your own children?" Robert stood slowly, facing his father. "And do you have the right to judge me? You who threw me out because you didn't approve of my choices?" "I made mistakes," Paul admitted, voice steady, "but I never abandoned you." The tension in the room was palpable, 3 generations worth of hurt and resentment surfacing at once. "Enough!" Sophie shouted suddenly, surprising them all. "Both of you, stop fighting. This isn't about you. It's about us, about Mom, about the choices you all made and how they affected us." Thomas, encouraged by his sister, added, "We lost our Mum. Now we find out we have a father and a grandfather we never knew. How do you think we feel?" Robert took a hesitant step toward the twins. "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but I want to try to fix this, to be the father you deserve." Sophie crossed her arms, her face set. "And if we don't want that, if it's too late?" Paul, seeing the pain in everyone's eyes, tried to mediate. "Sophie, Thomas, I understand your anger. Believe me, I do, but maybe this is an opportunity. A chance to heal old wounds, to build something new." "How can we trust him?" Thomas asked, voice trembling. "How do we know he won't abandon us again?" Robert, feeling the weight of that question, fell to his knees once more. "I can't change the past," he said, looking directly at his children, "but I can promise, here and now, that I will never leave you again. If you give me a chance, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for lost time." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with conflicting emotions. Paul looked from Robert to the twins, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Children," he said softly, "the decision is yours. No one can force you to forgive or accept Robert into your lives. But remember, forgiveness is sometimes less about the other person and more about freeing yourself from anger and pain." Sophie and Thomas looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Sophie spoke. "We can't forgive you. Not yet. Maybe never. But—" She hesitated, looking to Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "But maybe we can try. Try to know you, understand why you did what you did," Thomas added, voice soft. "Mum always said everyone deserves a second chance. Maybe this is yours." Robert let out a sob of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. "I promise I'll do everything to deserve this chance." Paul, feeling a critical moment had passed, stepped forward. "Then perhaps we should all sit down and talk. Really talk. There's so much to say, so much to understand." The hours that followed were intense, filled with tears, accusations, and eventually, moments of understanding. Robert shared his full story, his struggle with depression after leaving Claire, years of regret and self-criticism. Sophie and Thomas spoke of growing up without a father, of Claire's unwavering love, of their grief at her loss. Paul watched it all, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. So many years lost, so many wounds to heal. But here, in this room, he saw the first steps toward reconciliation. When night finally fell, they were all exhausted, emotionally drained. But there was also a sense of possibility, of a future no longer so dark. "What happens now?" Thomas asked, voice tired but curious. Paul looked at Robert, then at the twins. "Now, we try, one day at a time. It won't be easy. There will be hard days. But if we're all willing, maybe we can build something new, something better." Sophie nodded slowly. "One day at a time," she murmured. Robert, looking older and wiser than before, added softly, "And I'll be here every day, I promise." As the night deepened, and the family prepared to end this tumultuous day, Paul felt a spark of hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, full of doubts and setbacks. But for the first time in decades, there was the real possibility of healing, of redemption. Autumn gave way to winter, and as the seasons changed, so did the Durand family. 5 months had passed since the revelation that shook their lives. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. Paul watched from the porch as Sophie and Thomas played in the snow-covered garden, Robert hesitantly joining them in a snowball fight. The sound of the twins' laughter, once so rare, now echoed more often around the estate. "They're making progress," Martha said, bringing Paul a cup of hot tea. Paul nodded, a gentle smile on his lips. "Yes, they are. We all are." The early months were tough. Family therapy sessions twice a week helped navigate the minefield of repressed emotions and old hurts. There were days of shouting and tears, days of tense silence, and days when progress seemed impossible. But there were also moments of light. The first time Sophie allowed Robert to comfort her after a bad nightmare, the day Thomas asked Paul to teach him to play chess, just as Robert had learned as a child. Small moments that slowly wove a new family tapestry. Paul embraced his role as a grandfather with dedication that surprised even himself. He was determined not to repeat the mistakes he made with Robert. He attended every school presentation, helped with homework, and always had an attentive ear for the twins' worries. Robert faced the Herculean task of winning his children's trust. He moved to a nearby house, visiting almost daily. Each interaction was a tightrope walk, balancing the desire to make up for lost time and the respect for the boundaries Sophie and Thomas set. One afternoon, during a particularly intense family therapy session, Sophie finally voiced what she had been holding in for months. "I want to hate you," she told Robert, tears rolling down her face. "It would be easier if I could just hate you." Robert, heartbroken but determined, replied gently, "I understand, Sophie. And if hatred is what you need to feel right now, I accept it. I'll be here no matter what you feel about me." It was a turning point. Sophie's raw honesty and Robert's unconditional acceptance opened the door to deeper conversations and genuine healing. As December approached, the Durand mansion began to fill with Christmas spirit. To everyone's surprise, it was Thomas who suggested celebrating Christmas together. "Mom always said Christmas was for family," he explained shyly. "And now, well, we are a family, aren't we?" Preparing for Christmas became a family project. Paul supervised the decoration of the huge tree in the entrance hall, while Robert offered to bake the traditional family cookies, a recipe Claire used to make. On Christmas Eve, the mansion was warm and inviting. The smell of roast turkey and cinnamon filled the air. Paul, wearing a festive sweater, watched his family gathered in the living room. Sophie and Thomas, dressed in their best clothes, sat near the fireplace, their cheeks flushed with excitement. Robert, still a bit uncomfortable but clearly happy, adjusted the last ornaments on the tree. "Well," Paul said, drawing everyone's attention, "I think it's time for our annual toast. Though this year is, a bit different." Everyone gathered, glasses of sparkling cider in hand. Paul raised his glass, voice thick with emotion. This year brought changes none of us could have predicted. There was pain, confusion, and moments we thought we couldn't overcome. But there was also joy, discovery, and the chance to rebuild something precious we thought was lost forever. He looked at Sophie and Thomas, his eyes shining. "To my wonderful grandchildren, who taught me the true meaning of strength and forgiveness." Turning to Robert, Paul continued, "To my son, who had the courage to face his mistakes and fight for redemption." Finally, he looked at Claire's portrait above the mantel, adding softly, "And to Claire, whose memory and love continue to guide this family." "To family," they all said in unison, glasses clinking softly. After the toast, as everyone settled in for dinner, Sophie pulled Paul aside. "Grandpa," she said quietly, I wanted to thank you for everything, for giving us a home, for not giving up on us, for giving us a family again." Paul felt tears welling in his eyes. "Oh, Sophie," he murmured, hugging her tightly, "you've given me far more than I could ever repay." Across the room, Thomas chatted animatedly with Robert about a science project. The initial awkwardness had given way to a hesitant but growing camaraderie. As the evening wore on, filled with laughter, stories, and gift exchanges, Paul couldn't help but reflect on the journey that brought them here. A year ago, he was a lonely man, burdened by unspoken regrets. Now he was surrounded by love, forgiveness, and the promise of a bright future. Later, after dinner, as the adults talked in the living room, Sophie and Thomas slipped out to the porch, watching the snow fall softly. "It's strange, isn't it?" Thomas said quietly. "How everything changed so quickly." Sophie nodded, eyes distant. "Sometimes I miss Mom so much it hurts. But then you look at Grandpa Paul or Dad," Thomas completed, "and you feel like maybe, just maybe, things can be okay." Sophie smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Exactly. I think Mum would be happy to know we're not alone." Thomas took his sister's hand. "You know, I think I understand now what Mom meant about family. It's not just about blood or who raised you. It's about who's there for you, who loves you, even when it's hard." Sophie squeezed his hand. "It's about second chances too. And forgiveness. Even when it seems impossible." From inside the house, Paul's voice called, "Children, it's time for the Christmas pudding." The twins exchanged a glance, identical smiles spreading across their faces. With one last look at the starry sky, they returned inside to the warmth and love of their newly formed family. As Christmas Eve unfolded, filled with laughter, carols, and the promise of new beginnings, the Durand mansion shone with a light that surpassed festive decorations. It was the light of hope, forgiveness, and unconditional love. A family, once fractured by time and circumstance, now united, imperfect, but determined to build a future together. And so, on that cold December night, within the walls of the Durand mansion, the true spirit of Christmas, rebirth, redemption, and love burned brighter than any star in the sky.